right, so here we go. Our last day of material for the ecology unit. And as was just asked, will we have all day on Thursday to get the test done? I will be unlocking the test and setting it active Thursday. It will not close until Tuesday the 16th. So you will have a good span of time in order to get the test done. You'll only have one shot at it, but that'll let you, if you need a little bit more time, take a little bit more time for it. No problem. All right, so a couple other things that I should note before we move forward. Textbooks. I need the AP textbooks returned back to the high school by the 17th. Second, your Chromebooks that were distributed by the school need to be returned to the school by the 17th as well. They're apparently just sort of going to turn off. Like, they will literally cease to function. So please make sure that you get those turned back in. All right, onward for today. So when we take a look in our Schoology, we scroll down Tuesday, June 9th. This is what we're going to talk about today, and I've got my sources down here in case anybody wants to double check on things. So, environmental peril, and why currently we are looking at the end of environmental protection. Now, in order to do this justice, I really needed to go back to about the year 2000. Now, I decided to start at 2001 because 2001 was the start of the Bush presidency. And it seemed accurate looking at the last 20 years to start instead of the last year of a presidential reign at the beginning of a presidential reign. So, George Bush served two consecutive presidencies. So he was the president from 2001 to 2009. And here you can see a list of things that happened in the 8 years that he was in office that are all ecology related. So, one of the big things he went in on was to deregulate endangered species and to reduce the ability of the Endangered Species Act to stop industry, in particular things like logging, mining, and stuff like that, from impacting areas. Reduced and deregulated Clean Water and Clean Air Acts. He released 2.3 million acres of national preserved land open to drilling and coal. He defunded the EPA, and this happened multiple times over the 8 years that he was president. Overall, it resulted in a drop of about 15 to 20% in terms of EPA funding. He also oddly had an endorsement to allow whaling. Now, during George W. Bush's presidency, whaling was something that was not yet really illegal. There were ways to get around it. So, for instance, whales were allowed to be harvested, quote unquote, for scientific purpose. And what counted as scientific purpose? Well, like actual ecological studies. Absolutely, yes. But also, selling parts of the whales counted as scientific exploration, scientific use. And so, some companies were getting around the illegal nature of whaling by labeling themselves as being scientific and then turning around and just all they had to do was make sure that they sold the particular specimens to particular scientific institutions, and then all the rest of it was still allowed. So it was a weird little bypass there. So now obviously after two terms George Bush could not continue, and then he was succeeded by Barack Obama. Now I can't give all of the things that President Obama did during his 8 years quite as cleanly. There's a ton of them. If you check out, here is the government archives for what President Obama did while he was in the White House. I just have some of the key components here. President Obama was a big advocate for the environment. And so he put into play a number of different acts and laws, executive orders, etc., that were pushing us towards a very good place. Clean Power Plan basically just said major industries have to reduce the amount of CO2 that they pump out. The enhanced fuel efficiency asked vehicles by, I think it was 2035, to have an average mile per gallon of 52. Toxic Substances Control Act was the first time in over 2 decades that any law had been passed in order to control, detail, study, and limit the release of toxic substances into the environment. And predominantly, this one was talking about burying of chemicals from previous companies, previous eras of industry, basically, to test and make sure is this still safe. He worked with NOAA in order to reduce overfishing by jointly working with a lot of their data. The Restore Act put a huge amount of acres back into protection. Did some good stuff. Then Donald Trump happened. Now, I'm not going to go into my opinions. This is all scientific. This is all data. Um, since Donald Trump took office, we have seen we have seen about 100 different environmental policies that have been reduced, revoked, or rewritten. So the Clean Power Plan from President Obama, that was completely removed all limitations. The Paris Agreement. Now, technically, the Paris Agreement never meant anything. It was like everybody just saying, "Yeah, sure, we all promise that we'll work on this. We don't know how we'll work on it. There is no consequence for not working on it, and there is no reward for working on it. We just all say that we'll work on it." Well, we backed out of that. Interestingly, once signed into the Paris Agreement, you cannot leave until 2021. So technically, despite the fact that Donald Trump said that we exited, we are still part of the Paris Agreement because you can't leave it. Now the OIAI. Basically, what this was an emissions standard, and what was redone, or what was done by removing this, is that industry can now develop its own methods, and it must develop its own technologies to reach lower emissions than it had before. That is required. They must find a way to reduce their emissions. The sketchy part is that once they do, they're not legally required to use those methods. They merely need to develop them. Now, the Affordable Clean Energy Rule is actually a good one. Yes, Donald Trump passed a good ecological law effectively. Basically, what it was an executive order that told states that they are going to have increased power in determining how energy is developed, sustained, and maintained within state limits. So this results in some states like California being able to really crack down and get much tighter on exactly what they allow in their state. But it does also allow some other states that are less concerned to release. So it's a little bit of both, but this was a positive rule that came in. Now, the fuel efficiency law that President Obama signed in, Donald Trump reduced it from 52 miles per gallon by 2025, there it is, to 32 miles per gallon by 2021. So he sped up the time frame but reduced the average mile per gallon. My Toyota already gets 40, so it's already exceeds the requirement. He revoked executive order that had, so government construction projects. Obama signed an executive order that said that government construction projects must take into account rising ocean levels in their construction. Donald Trump simply removed that executive order so that they no longer need to design with that eventuality in mind. reduce the number of protected waters, and this was just 2016 to 2017. For 2017 to 2018, we saw a whole bunch more. Endangered Species Act weakened even more. The Migratory Bird Treaty was between us and several other countries that birds migrate through. And basically, what we did was open it up and say, all right, well, these areas can now be used to run power lines, drill for oil, etc., etc. Bear Ears and Grand Staircase are both really big national parks that were opened up for drilling and mining, increased logging, delist climate change from the national security threat, reduce EPA funding by 2.5 billion, dollars, which is 31% of their yearly budget. You know, lots of stuff, and that's 2017 to 2018. From 2018 to present, believe it or not, altered the Toxic Substances Control Act so that basically chemicals are they're not allowed to track chemicals anymore. So before, with the Obama administration's original implementation of this, what happened was if they found one of these chemicals in groundwater, they were allowed to do some pretty extensive testing to find out where it's coming from. Well, they can't do that anymore. Uh, President Obama also banned neonicotinoids, which are a common pesticide, but it has been linked directly to the bees and colony collapse disorder. Well, that ban was reversed. The Great Lakes, which we have to deal quite a bit with, had its funding reduced by 90%. The list goes on and on. And I literally just saw something new today about another uh, ecological law that had been revoked. Now, this is kind of a running tally of what the Trump administration has said they're doing. You see that with the combined value of the red and the orange. The red ones are the ones that they've actually gone through with. The orange ones are ones that they say that the administration is still looking into. And over here in the gray, that would be the total. If all of this comes to pass, this is the number of environmental laws, policies, executive orders, etc., that will be reversed, reverted, changed, etc., etc. So, no lie, we're seeing a big shift in the last 4 years from our federal government in response to how it views and how it treats the natural wild areas of our planet. That is to say, though, I don't want you guys to get too depressed. Now, people will claim that, it's these changes that have improved our economy, and there are graphs for all sides, but the economy has continued to see increase since Donald Trump took office. Is that related to the ecological changes? Maybe. Is it merely the continuing trend that Barack Obama established before him? Maybe. But you can find all sorts of different stuff about different economic things. Unfortunately, all of the economic growth that we've seen has not affected our deficit, which you can see our deficit has continued to get larger and larger and larger. I saw this one and I had to include it because this is really how the media is handling climate change. All right, so let's take a look at some positive things, though, right? Like we've seen a lot of negative stuff happening. Let's see some positive. So it is important to note that in the threat of deforestation, we're seeing a lot of different organizations starting to work together to try to help people understand the amount or the importance of our forests. National Geographic, which is owned by Disney, one of the richest companies on the planet, has started to buy and protect land with the goal being 30%. Scientists agree that if we have 30%, we can maintain our levels of oxygen, excuse me, for life on the planet, which is great. And here you can see replanting. So this whole forest side here, right now these are just little trees because the whole area was cleared at some point, but you can see they're starting to grow and this will become a full growth forest eventually. The effect that this can have is really quite substantial. And as you guys are probably familiar with, the Team Trees from YouTube, with the goal to raise $20 million to plant 20 million trees by the end of 2020, did indeed succeed and has been actively paying that money back out in order to get more forests. Habitat destruction, right? So when we build cities and roads, power lines and municipals and stuff like that, we're destroying all kinds of habitat. Well, we're moving forward with that too. U.S. Fish and Wildlife is developing plans to try to recover 53 species from the endangered or threatened list. We're back to allowing nature to do a lot of um, what it wants to. Matrix Habitat is all about trying to engineer our disruptions to have the least impact. And wildlife corridors are really pretty interesting. This is a wildlife corridor through farmland that will allow the animals that normally live in these forested and wooded areas to still move between a larger ecosystem here and a larger one over here. This is a wildlife corridor going over a road system so that when deer or what have you want to move from one side to the other, they can and they don't need to go across the human constructions. They can go over it. And one really neat thing that happened, this happened about 15, no, not 15 years ago, 10 years ago ish, maybe 8. Anyway, this is a barred owl. Barred owls are like a swamp owl. They like living in wet places, particularly down around Louisiana. Well, one of our wildlife conservation companies, basically, they had one of their biologists discovered that there was a small population of these in the middle of some swampland. And what the company did was, instead of announcing that they had found them, they quietly started to buy all the swampland. And because it's swampland, looks like this, it's worth next to nothing. So they bought up hundreds and hundreds of acres. And then after they had all those acres, then they released information that there was an endangered species living on there, which then immediately conferred full protection to the entire land property line that they had established. Really clever way to get the land necessary to protect and conserve the animal. Now, monocultures. I don't know how many of you took a look at our monocultures. A couple days ago, I gave you two different slideshows. One was monocultures, the other one was urbanization. Well, here we have all of our solutions to monocultures. There are none. Right now, we need the monocultures because it is the best technology that we have available to produce the density of food on the land and reduce the amount of land required to do so. Until we have a solution, this is going to continue. And if you don't know what it is, go back and check that slideshow. I think it was Thursday of last week. It's really interesting if you're not familiar with it. And it's going to be one of the great challenges in the coming decades. Now, invasive species, we talked about a lot, and one of the good things that happened is the DEC had its guidelines changed, basically, so they can respond much faster to invasive species. We can see that people are starting to put up actual money, particularly to locate the other people who are responsible for introducing the organisms. We find more and more uses of biological controls. So the cottony cushion scale is this little thing. It generally looks like some fluff on a plant. Well, it's actually a herbivorous insect, and it kind of bites in and sucks the sap out and kills the plant. Well, ladybugs, we may not think of ladybugs, but they are an unbelievably voracious predator. They eat a lot of bugs. And so by introducing ladybugs into the areas where this cushion scale has gotten established, we see the ladybug population rapidly moves up to match it. And it kind of forces their populations back down below the damage threshold. So it's not eliminating them from the environment, but it is reducing them enough that they're no longer having a real ecological impact. So biological controls are huge. This is not a biological control, but it is a very real thing going on along the East Coast, particularly down around Florida. Is you can have shops will modify handguns to fire underwater to allow people to go handgun fishing for lionfish. Invasive lionfish are a massive, massive problem. And the decision was basically that some bullets in the water, like stuck into the sand or the coral or what have you, are going to cause way less ecological damage than the never ending population of lionfish. So have at it. Now, this is a still from the Inconvenient Truth video that we watched some of yesterday. Now, what I want to point out is this orange line, as it builds up, this is the amount of carbon dioxide that we are emitting, right? This is what we're putting out there. And that continues up this way for the expectation towards 2050. Now, each one of these little colored slices here is representative of one of these technologies, also color coded, and how much it could reduce our carbon footprint. By using electricity end use efficiency, aka Energy Star, we can reduce it by this much. Other end use efficiencies, things like insulating houses, just to make sure that we don't lose heat or cooling, can reduce it this much. Passenger vehicle efficiency, getting the fuel efficiency to 52 miles per gallon could reduce it more. Other transport, meaning basically tractor trailers that are moving our goods, make them more efficient. Renewable sources, wind, sun, water, things like that, hydroelectric, can reduce it further. CCS is carbon sequestration, and supply efficiency, basically referring to how many trees we cut down and replanting. Look, if we had all this, if we used all of these things, we could reduce our carbon output to pre-industrial levels, to a level back before 1900. And this was available technology in 2005 when this video was made. So our technologies have only gotten better since then. If we could get the will to change, we have all the tools we need right now in order to do so. And in order to kind of start to fix this. I mean, you guys have all seen stuff about how we can do it ourselves, which is absolutely accurate, but it's worth noting in this country, 80% of the greenhouse gases that are produced are not produced by individuals. They're produced by major industrial companies. So even if every human being on or in the United States were to do this, at best it could reduce it a portion of 20%. What we really need is we need the companies that are doing most of the damage to be the ones to step up. Failure to do so will lead to all of these increased risks, deaths, displacements, habitat destruction, There's a lot of stuff that relies on this, but we are moving in the right direction. And as much as things may seem otherwise, we do have the capability of fixing this. We just need people who are willing to do it in positions of power. So, hopefully, that clears up, gives people some hope for the future. There's a lot of stuff going on, but there's a lot of hope to have also. This isn't a sinking ship, the ship is merely taking on water. We can, and I believe will, as long as leadership and the people enact their will. Um, we will right the ship. We will fix it. We will continue to sail successfully to our end destination. All right, I will see everyone tomorrow for review. That was the last of anything that you're going to need for the test and all of this stuff. Mostly just have an example of how are we answering threats to our ecology. That entire last section. Just have one of those as your back pocket example that you can pull out when you need it in order to say, yes, well, one of the ways. And that should be about all you need.